regime here. We are going over chapter 20, the endocrine system. We've wrapped up the nervous system. We'll still be mentioning it here. There's a little bit of interplay here, actually quite a bit actually, since we'll be talking about the brain and control of the adrenal gland, but we're going to be talking about another control system of the body, the endocrine system. We saw how the nervous system controls parts of our body. It has the ability to control muscles and organs in different parts of your body. The endocrine system too can control things, but in a very different way. So we'll be looking at the different endocrine organs, as well as their histology. This is going to be a heavy histology chapter. It'll be important to recognize not only where these organs are, but what the histology looks like and why it looks like the way it does. As always, we study how structure relates to function, even at the histology tissue level. As far as function, this isn't physiology, so we're not going to go over mechanism, but you should know which hormones are produced by which areas and the basic function of these hormones. What do these hormones do? What does testosterone do? What does growth hormone do? What does adrenocorticotropic hormone do? So in that thread, we'll be looking at some very, very basic pathways, how one hormone activates one organ, and that organ can release another hormone, which can activate another organ. We'll see how there's these pathways of endocrine signaling. Fun metaphor of the day. What we're looking at here is a view from a plane, and they are airdropping supplies. When you airdrop stuff, you try to fly over the place that needs the supplies. You do fly over the place that needs supplies, and you're going to drop it in that area. You want to get it within a certain radius. It's not going to be perfect that you get it exactly at one specific point, but as long as you get it within a radius, you're going to be generally okay. This is in stark contrast, say, with sending something very, very targeted. With the nervous system, back to biology, with the nervous system, when you send a signal, it's very targeted. You have a neuron leading directly to your target, releasing a neurotransmitter onto that thing. The endocrine system is more like airdropping. You're getting it into the vicinity. You're not getting the specific organ necessarily. It might get other places too, but it'll eventually get to the organ, and that works. When the endocrine system, let's take a look at this diagram here on the left. When the endocrine system releases hormones, hormones are signal molecules, it releases into the bloodstream. And blood goes almost everywhere in your body. Wherever there are blood vessels, hormones can go. Eventually, the hormone is going to reach its target. And targets are places where you have receptors. So there are special receptors that these targets have. So the hormone finally makes it to the target, it binds the receptor, and it causes some kind of a change in the cell. When the endocrine system does this, the signaling is relatively slow. When I say slow, I mean seconds to minutes to hours, and then changes can last really long term, days to years. For instance, if you go through puberty, you're getting tons of sex hormones released into your system, and those cause permanent changes to your body. So the endocrine system relies on using the bloodstream, using your blood vessels to deliver hormones to distant target organs to cause slow, long-term general responses. Compare this with the nervous system, where you have a neuron that releases neurotransmitter to a target to cause a very specific, fast response. It's very fast thanks to electrical signals, those action potentials. There are chemicals still used at most synapses. You have neurotransmitters being released, but thanks to that electricity, it goes pretty fast. I said seconds to minutes was slow. Milliseconds is fast, relatively. So the nervous system, you get near instantaneous responses. Despite both having different methods of signaling, both the endocrine system and nervous system have the ability to control our bodies. We saw how the nervous system can control smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and glands. Here, the endocrine system can also influence those things, just in very different ways. For example, hormones can stimulate growth. Hormones can stimulate your alertness. Hormones can stimulate your sexual development. Those are different things than what we've seen with the nervous system, where you get immediate muscular or glandular responses. Sometimes they even work together. Sometimes the nervous system stimulates the endocrine system, which we're going to see here in a minute. But overall, together, these two control systems, the nervous system and the endocrine system, regulate what your body does on a daily basis. The endocrine system is maybe the least cohesive system. When we talk about the nervous system, it's very clear. It's the brain, spinal cord, and the nerves that come out of it. When you talk about the cardiovascular system, it's the heart and blood vessels. When you talk about the digestive system, it's everything from your mouth to your anus, and then some accessory organs like salivary glands, pancreas, and liver in between. The endocrine system, what links everything are blood vessels. So blood vessels are essential to the endocrine system, but there are organs pretty much everywhere all over your body. Even organs that you don't think of as endocrine organs can contain endocrine cells. For example, the heart, as we know, is a cardiovascular organ. It pumps blood, but did you know it also produces hormones? These hormones are important for regulating blood pressure. The digestive tract is important for digesting food, but it's also important for producing hormones that regulate digestion. And as you can see, there are many others. This is not even a fully comprehensive list of endocrine organs. The ones that we are going to focus on are the following. We're going to look at the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid glands, pineal gland, liver, adrenal gland, both adrenal medulla and adrenal cortex, the pancreas, the testes, and the ovaries. Those are the ones that we're going to focus on in this class. We will actually talk a little bit about the kidneys later on when we get to kidneys, but for now, we're not going to focus on that. I think this is a healthy list of glands and hormones to go over. So keep that in mind that we're going to go over these. We're going to go over these specific organs. We're going to start in the head. We already learned about the hypothalamus. Remember, the hypothalamus is an area of the brain that regulates a lot of homeostatic activities. Included in that is regulating homeostasis through hormones. So let's take a look at how the hypothalamus does that. The hypothalamus along with the pituitary gland. Let me redraw the brain here. See this brain right here? Actually, you know what? I'll just rely on this picture. If you look at the brain right here, you can see the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is right here. And then hanging off of the hypothalamus, you have the pituitary. Tiny, tiny, small gland there, protected by the cella turcica of the sphenoid. We're going to zoom in on this right now. We're zooming in right here. That's what you see right here. This area is the hypothalamus. And then down here is the pituitary hanging off. Some terminology to remind you of where we are. To remember like the location, remember that this part here, this is the optic chiasm. Over here, the mammillary bodies would be found. The stalk, this piece right here, that's allowing the pituitary to hang down, this stalk is called the infundibulum. The infundibulum will be really important. We'll see why. Right. Okay. So those are some basic parts. I'm actually going to erase this so I can make other notes. The pituitary is actually divided into two parts, and the two parts are distinct, not just because one's more on one side, one's more on the other. It's because they're actually made of different tissues. There's an anterior portion, which is shown here, and there is a posterior portion, which I'm tracing here in green on the other picture, shown here. Let's talk about the posterior portion first. The posterior portion, the posterior pituitary, is continuous with the brain. It's continuous with the brain. What I mean by that is, take a look in this picture on the right, bottom right. Here we have a neuron cell body. I'm going to trace one. Cell body, it's multipolar, dendrite, dendrite, dendrite. Its axon goes down the infundibulum. And its axon terminal ends in the posterior pituitary. So really, the posterior pituitary is just an extension of the hypothalamus. You have neurons that start in the hypothalamus and end in the posterior pituitary. They release their chemical messengers, their hormones. They release their hormones into the bloodstream that's found in the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, take a look on the left side here, bottom left. Anterior pituitary, something different's going on. Let's look at the hypothalamus first. In the hypothalamus, we have neurons, multipolar. They extend to the infundibulum, but don't go all the way down. They end right here. So here's an axon terminal. From that axon terminal, you actually get a release of hormones into a bloodstream, which I'm going to color in blue. They get released into a bloodstream called the Hypophyseal portal system. Hypophyseal portal system. There are blood vessels in between the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, known as the hypophyseal portal system. Hormones from the hypothalamus get released into these blood vessels, which then get sent to the anterior pituitary. Very short distance. And then in the anterior pituitary, you've got cells that are actual endocrine tissue. Endocrine, if you recall, is a specialized type of epithelium, a specialized type of glandular epithelium. Exocrine glands are epithelium. They release to ducts or to the surface of your skin. Endocrine glands release to the bloodstream. So you have these specialized epithelial cells that release hormone into the bloodstream. When we look at the histology of these two areas, we're going to see very different things. The posterior pituitary is neural tissue, specifically axons and axon terminals. Do you see the axon here in the infundibulum? Axons and axon terminals are going to be what we'll be looking for the posterior pituitary, while the anterior pituitary are endocrine cells, which is a type of epithelium. When we look at epithelium, remember, we want to look for darker packed cells. It shows that cellularity. Whereas neural tissue, if we're looking for axons, we're going to look for lighter colored and texture in one direction. Fibrous texture. Take a look at this first top right picture. One side is anterior, one side is posterior. At this low magnification, we can't quite see the texture, but we see a distinction in color. And I shouldn't say color, I should say intensity. Really, they can be colored blue or purple or green. It really doesn't matter. It's about the intensity. Clearly, this side is more intense. The side that's more intense, that's where you have darker packed cells. That's epithelium. This is the anterior side. Whereas over here on the right, this is lighter colored. This is the posterior side. And here we can see the same thing. This is a posterior pituitary, while this is the anterior pituitary. Go by intensity. You can tell that if it's lighter colored in general, it's posterior, darker colored, it's anterior. Because darker is epithelial, endocrine, posterior is neural tissue, nervous tissue. Let's look at our first hormones being released here, starting with the posterior pituitary, because there are fewer hormones on this side that I'd like you to know. From the posterior pituitary, let me point this out again. We start in the hypothalamus. In the hypothalamus, we have neurons. I'm going to draw a multipolar neuron here. Its axon extends down the infundibulum into the posterior pituitary, and here's the axon terminal. And then it's going to release hormone into the bloodstream, which reaches the rest of the body. There are two hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus and therefore released by the posterior pituitary in this situation from this neuron. Two different hormones. One hormone is called antidiuretic hormone, ADH. I do want you to know the full name, antidiuretic hormone. Anti means against, opposite of. Diuresis means to get rid of water. Quickest way that we can eliminate high amounts of water is by urinating it out. So antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that prevents the release of water through urination. What it does is that it tells our kidneys, so this is a hormone that targets the kidneys. Our kidneys have receptors for antidiuretic hormone. It tells the cells of the kidneys to absorb more water. It tells the cells of your kidneys to absorb more water. Antidiuretic hormone has a second name. The two names are interchangeable. The other name is vasopressin. Vaso means blood vessel. Pressin means pressure. So vasopressin literally means a hormone that increases blood pressure. If you increase how much water there is in your body, if you retain more water means more content, more volume in your blood vessels. More volume means more pressure. So by retaining more water, you're also increasing blood pressure. Both go hand in hand. They go hand in hand. So if you are dehydrated, your hypothalamus will produce and your posterior pituitary will release antidiuretic hormone. It'll signal to the receptors on cells in your kidney to retain water, you retain water. And also, this could be the case if you need to have increased blood pressure. And often those two go hand in hand. If you're dehydrated, your blood pressure starts to drop. Another hormone produced by the hypothalamus and released from the posterior pituitary is a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin, it's actually a very complicated hormone, evolutionarily very old. It's even found in lots of other animals of all kinds. We're not going to focus on some of the things that you might have heard of, what oxytocin does. If you're familiar, it's that love hormone that, say, when you are intensely in love with someone or you have a baby, you feel a strong connection with that person or thing. It does do that, but we're going to focus on the more anatomical changes that oxytocin allows. Oxytocin can target the reproductive system. In the male reproductive system, it targets the ductus deferens and the prostate. And in doing so, it helps with ejaculation, releasing of semen. In the female reproductive system, it can target the uterus to help with contraction, and it can target the mammary glands to help with milk ejection. Now, this is a pretty diverse, even with this narrow scope of what I'd like you to know, this is pretty diverse in terms of the actions or results. We get lactation, we get contractions, we get ejaculation. What do all of these have in common? The ductus deferens and prostate, the uterus and mammary glands, they all have smooth muscle. Really, you're targeting smooth muscle of these reproductive organs to cause the movement of semen out, to cause the pushing of a baby out, to cause the release of milk out the nipple. Oxytocin stimulates smooth muscle contraction. So those are the two major hormones that I'd like you to know, produced by the hypothalamus, released by the posterior pituitary. Same neuron, set of neurons. On the other side, on the anterior pituitary, let's focus on, whoops. I'm actually going to draw your attention away from this for a second. When you look at this diagram, the hypothalamus has neurons that release hormone into a blood vessel system. Remember that this blood vessel system is known as the Hypophyseal portal system. It's found here in this infundibulum. So these neurons that don't extend all the way down the infundibulum to the posterior pituitary, these neurons release hormone into this hypophyseal portal system. There's several different hormones that these neurons can release. We are going to simplify it and just collectively refer to them as releasing hormone. Releasing hormone. They're called releasing hormone because when these hormones get released into the hypophyseal portal system, and when they reach cells of the pituitary gland, what the cells of the pituitary gland do in turn is that they get stimulated. They have receptors for this releasing hormone. They get stimulated and they release their own hormone to the rest of the blood vessels of the rest of the body. And those hormones can then stimulate something else. Releasing hormone is a hormone that stimulates endocrine cells to release their own hormone. We're getting a hormone to cause the release of a hormone, hence releasing hormone. Rewind that if you need to. Releasing hormone causes the release of more hormone. Let's look at our first example. Our first example is prolactin. Prolactin is released from the anterior pituitary. So when a special releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus, reaches the anterior pituitary, these endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary release prolactin. And prolactin targets mammary glands. We just saw how oxytocin targets mammary glands. Oxytocin targets the smooth muscle of mammary glands. Prolactin targets the glandular cells, the milk-producing cells of the mammary glands. So prolactin is for milk production. It promotes lactation. Prolactin promote lactation, whereas oxytocin promotes release. So they work together. Prolactin promotes production. Oxytocin promotes release. If we take a closer look at the anterior pituitary here, we can see acidophils, something called acidophils, which I'm going to highlight in green. Acidophils are these pinker colored cells. You see there's a mix of pink colored, purple colored, and even a lighter, clearer color. Prolactin is released by acidophils. We're going to see that acidophils release another hormone, and then the purple ones release different hormones as well. There are several hormones produced and released here from the anterior pituitary. To recap, hypothalamus, neurons in the hypothalamus release releasing hormone, stimulate cells in the anterior pituitary. So these cells, the acidophils in the anterior pituitary, release prolactin. Prolactin goes to the mammary glands. It goes all over the body, but mammary glands have receptors for this. Mammary glands get stimulated, they grow and release milk. And if you remember, how is milk released? What type of secretion? It's an exocrine secretion. Specifically, it's apocrine. Milk is released by growing and shedding. Not blowing up, not bursting, by shedding. The hypothalamus and anterior pituitary control sexual development. So let's take a look at the hypothalamus again. We have a neuron here. It releases releasing hormone. Don't worry about the specific name of it. It releases releasing hormone into that hypophyseal portal system. That releasing hormone makes it to the anterior pituitary. And from here, we get a release of hormone. There's actually two hormones released here. Together, they're known as gonadotropins, trope, or troph. That equals growth or stimulation. So gonadotropin is a protein, a hormone that stimulates the gonads. The gonads are your ovaries and testes. Ovaries and testes are gonads. Specifically, the two gonadotropins that are released from the anterior pituitary, they are known as luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. There's a reason why they have these very specific names. It has to do with the female reproductive system. It has to do with ovaries. We'll get to that later. But they're called luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Despite getting their names from the female reproductive system, they're present in everyone. All people have these hormones normally. When they're released, they're not released from those pink acidophils. They're released from the darker purple basophils. Basophils produce and release luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary releases luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. This hormone makes its way around the body and then can stimulate the testes and the ovaries. The testes and ovaries, in turn, will release their own hormone, sex hormones. Estradiol is a very specific form of estrogen. It's a more common form of estrogen. There's many forms of estrogen. Progesterone is another female sex hormone, and testosterone is a male sex hormone. These are what are released from the gonads. We'll see which one's from which here in a second. So since we're talking about the ovaries and testes, let's actually take a closer look at these organs, the gonads. When we think about the ovaries and testes, you probably think about egg production in the ovaries, sperm production in the testes. That, of course, happens. We're going to focus on that when we get to the reproductive chapter. Right now, we're going to focus on the hormones. Take a look here at the ovary. This is actually zooming in on an ovary. So look at the bottom. There's the whole ovary. We're zooming in on just a portion, a small portion. This is high magnification on a small portion of an ovary. Specifically, we see this circular structure. The term for the circular structure, this is a follicle. A round spherical structure, in this case, is called a follicle. There's a reason why, again, it's called follicle stimulating hormone. Here's a follicle in the ovary. At the center of the follicle, this large round structure, this is our egg, our oocyte. O, you pronounce the O twice, oocyte. That's the little word for egg. Again, we're going to focus on the egg later. We're going to focus on the oocyte later. We want to focus on the hormones being produced. Surrounding the oocyte in this layer that I'm coloring yellow, and it's a decently thick layer. This layer of cells that I've just shaded in, these are granulosa cells. Granulosa cells, because they look like little granules, little specks. Granulosa cells produce estradiol. Let me erase some of my shading so you can see it a little bit better. Granulosa cells, they're kind of cuboidal. Think of them as stratified cuboidal. So here's a special case where we don't see it as a duct. Stratified cuboidal cells producing estradiol. Outside of the granulosa cells, we have cells that are a bit thinner and flatter. We're going to say that it's stratified squamous, even though it's not, but they're more squamous-like. Thinner, flatter cells. These are called theca cells. Theca cells produce the sex hormone progesterone. Both estradiol and progesterone are important hormones for all people, especially in the female reproductive system. They can help with pregnancy, they can help with female sexual development. Progesterone means to promote gestation, to help with pregnancy. So that's when that's released most, and we'll get to that again later on. But estradiol is produced from granulosa cells, progesterone is produced by theca cells. In the testes, in the male reproductive system, testes, you have these large, well, not that large, but largish oval organs. If you slice open one of the testes, you're going to see a bunch of packed tubes. And so if you cut a tube on an end, you're going to see a circle. That's what this is. So this circle isn't a sphere. This circle is part of a tube. This is a seminiferous tubule. And in this seminiferous tubule, you get production of sperm. Sperm are in this lumen. This is a lumen in the center of the tube. We'll talk about all of that later. So the seminiferous tubule is where you produce sperm, produce semen, seminiferous semen. I want you to actually look outside of these tubes. So here's a tube, here's a tube. When you look in between the tubes, here and here and here and here and here, or here and here and here and here, or here and here. When you look in between the tubes, you find these cells. These are called Leydig cells. You can see that they're called interstitial here. It's the same thing. I call them Leydig cells because that's another name for them. Leydig cells produce testosterone. And testosterone is that hormone that's produced in higher amounts on average in the male reproductive system, thanks to the testes that help with male sexual development. So 3 cell types we've gone over here. Theca cells produce progesterone, granulosa cells produce estradiol, Leydig cells produce testosterone. And these are all stimulated by luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone, which came from the anterior pituitary. And then that got stimulated from the hypothalamus. So your brain in this process, your brain is controlling your reproduction. So we've talked about milk production with the anterior pituitary. We've talked about sexual development with the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary controls metabolism. Looking at the hypothalamus, we have neurons. Neurons releasing hormone into this hypophyseal portal system. We stimulate cells in the pituitary gland, and these cells release hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is released also from those dark basophils, just like follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone. As the name suggests, thyroid stimulating hormone binds to receptors on the thyroid gland. We'll see where that is here in a second. And in the thyroid gland, there are these cells that produce hormones, thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. T3 and T4 get released to the rest of the body and have widespread metabolism effects. What does metabolism mean? Metabolism very generally means energy usage by your cells. We are influencing how much energy your cells are using. When you use up a lot of energy, like when you exercise, your body gets hot. That's an indication. That's one indication that your body's using a lot of energy, that your body runs hot. Not necessarily in every case, but in many cases. Let's take a closer look at the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland, take a look at the top right, is located surrounding your larynx and the superior portion of your trachea. Sometimes it's 2 separate pieces, sometimes it's connected here in the middle, but the thyroid gland is just wrapping around inferior to your Adam's apple, to your laryngeal prominence, and a little bit lateral. The thyroid gland, like in that first photo of these slides, there's a special scanning electron micrograph. You can see follicles. So take a look at the bottom left now. You see a bunch of follicles. So there's that word again, follicle. The word follicle means a spherical structure. And why are we seeing spherical or circular structures in general? When we have glands, you're maximizing surface area when you have a bunch of cells in a circle, and that way you can release hormones into different areas. So we'll see that actually hormones produced inside of these follicles, but then it's released to the outside. So the cells, these follicular cells that I'm tracing here in the histology, These are follicular cells. They're simple cuboidal. These cells release thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone, there's actually two of them, and we're abbreviating them. Don't worry about the full name. T3 and T4. Collectively, we can just call them thyroid hormones. These hormones get released to the bloodstream and influence the rest of your body to use energy. Take a look at the illustration here at the bottom right. It's just showing what's on the left side. Here are those follicular cells that produce the thyroid hormone. The inside of the follicle is called the colloid. The inside of the follicle is called the colloid. This is actually where T3 and T4 are assembled. So the colloid is an important portion of these follicles. And then you release hormone. Let's say you have T4, you release hormone into a blood vessel outside of the follicle. So it has to go through those follicular cells. So the thyroid gland is important for metabolism. You release T3, T4 in response to thyroid stimulating hormone stimulating the thyroid. There's actually one more hormone produced and released by the thyroid, and it's completely unrelated to what we've just been talking about to make things even more complicated and fun. There's another hormone called calcitonin. Calcitonin. Calcitonin is a hormone that tells your body to lower calcium ion levels in your plasma, in your blood. It tells your body to reduce calcium levels from your blood. Why would you want to do that? There are cells in your thyroid called C cells. C cells are in between the follicles. C cells are in between follicles. We just saw how Leydig cells are in between seminiferous tubules. C cells are in between follicles. They sense, because they're closer to the blood vessels, they sense when your calcium ion levels in your blood are relatively high, higher than normal. They sense when calcium levels are high. So then C cells in response will release calcitonin, and it'll change the tone of your calcium levels. It will tell your bone, to add more calcium to it. So which cells will it stimulate? Which cells add calcium to bone? It's going to stimulate osteoblasts. You can also reduce calcium levels in your blood by getting rid of it through your urine. It's already in your blood, and you can filter your blood with which organ? You can filter it with your kidneys. So you're also stimulating your kidneys. Calcitonin is released from the thyroid, specifically from C cells, and C cells stimulate the osteoblasts to add more bone and add more calcium to bone and remove calcium with your kidneys. Why would you want to get rid of calcium in your kidneys? Our bodies are all about homeostasis. We don't want to have too much of something. We don't want to have too little of something. We want to be just right, that Goldilocks rule. Bad things can happen when we have too much or too little. So even though counterintuitively you might think, oh, lots and lots of calcium is going to be better, up to a point. There's always a limit to how much can be good. It's like cake is amazing. I want to keep eating cake, but there's a limit. So that's calcitonin released by C cells, completely separate from releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, T3, T4 thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland. More hormones from the anterior pituitary. Let's take a look at the hypothalamus again at the top right. Here we have a neuron releasing hormone into the hypophyseal portal system of the infundibulum. We make our way to the anterior pituitary, and we have cells here that then get stimulated and release their own hormone. In this case, we're releasing growth hormone. Growth hormone is released by those pink acidophils, which we've seen, which also release prolactin. So not basophils, acidophils. So acidophils release two hormones. Acidophils release growth hormone, acidophils release prolactin. As the name suggests, growth hormone stimulates cells of your body to grow. Muscle can grow, bone can grow, you just grow. Lots of growth can happen. So this is going to be released as you age, as you grow older. As we become adults, we have limited growth hormone, natural growth hormone release. Maybe you've heard of people who use growth hormone illegally as a supplement to get even bigger. Or as a treatment for people with dwarfism to help grow to a more average size, because it reduces lots of physical issues when you grow to a near average size. So growth hormone can actually target cells all over the body. Growth hormone can also target the liver. The liver, that really big organ in your abdominal pelvic cavity. We know the liver as a digestive organ, or you may or may not know that it produces a substance called bile. We'll get to all that later. The liver does many things. One of the things that the liver does is produce its own hormone. The liver produces a hormone called insulin-like growth factors. It's not insulin, it's insulin-like. We'll get to insulin later. Insulin-like growth factors. The cells of the liver, they're called hepatocytes. When we look at liver histology, we see this hexagonal formation that repeats over and over and over again. It's called a lobule. And the hepatocytes are all of these cells that are radiating around the center of this lobule. So these cells, these hepatocytes of the liver, are the ones producing insulin-like growth factors. You can even see the blood vessel. Let me erase all this. You can even see the blood vessel in the center. There's a blood vessel here called the central vein. So you're releasing hormone into that vein, which gets released to the rest of your body. Insulin-like growth factors works together with growth hormone to target cells all over your body to tell it to grow. So both growth hormone and insulin-like growth factors stimulate cells all over your body to grow. There's one more hormone. Let's recap, actually. I'm going to erase this for a second. Whoops. Let's recap what we've learned so far. We've seen that basophils release luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating, thyroid stimulating hormone, and then we saw acidophils release prolactin and growth hormone. Separately, in the hypothalamus posterior pituitary, we saw oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. We also saw how the hypothalamus alone releases releasing hormone. We've also seen other hormones released from the ovaries and the testes and the liver and the thyroid, and we're going to see even more glands. But this is what we've gone over so far. Specifically in the anterior pituitary, when we have those basophils and acidophils, we've gone over 5 so far. Here's our 6th. Our 6th one is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is released from basophils. So there's 4 different hormones released from basophils. There's actually a 5th. We're not going to go over it. You might have heard of endorphins. We're not going to have time to cover that. But anyways, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and adrenocorticotropic hormone are all released from basophils. I'm going to clear this so now we can focus on adrenocorticotropic hormone. And that's a really long name, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Despite its long name, it's actually, if you break it down, it makes a lot of sense. Tropic, we just learned, like a gonadotropin. Tropic means to stimulate, to help grow. So it's a hormone that stimulates. Cortico, you've seen this word before. Cerebral cortex, cerebellar cortex. Cortex just means outer covering. It's the outer portion of something. Adreno, we're referring to the adrenal gland. So the adrenal cortex, this outer portion of the adrenal gland, which I'm shading here in green, we're stimulating the outer portion of the adrenal gland, hence adrenocorticotropic hormone. Makes sense, super long. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is released by basophils. Let me go through that pathway. In the hypothalamus, you have neurons. They release releasing hormone. Releasing hormone stimulates pituitary gland cells. Pituitary gland cells release adrenocorticotropic hormone. Specifically, basophils release adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex, the outer portion of the adrenal gland. The outer portion of the adrenal gland releases its own hormone called cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone that has general effects of stress on your body. When you hear the word stress, we generally associate that with a bad thing. That's not necessarily true biologically. All stress means biologically is putting any exertion on your body. Simply being awake puts stress on your body. I don't mean to sound that like a negative thing. Again, it's just anytime your body does any exertion, just literally being awake is exerting yourself. Trying to maintain your body temperature, trying to move around, that's exerting yourself. Your body needs to be ready for it. And to be ready for these stressful long-term events, long-term stress events, you need a hormone like cortisol to tell your body to be alert, awake, free up energy reserves so that you can be ready and prepared for stressful events. I want to contrast this type of stress with the short-term stress that we see in that fight or flight or freeze response from the sympathetic response. We're going to go over the sympathetic response again in the next video. But when we look at the sympathetic response, it's very quick because it's controlled by the nervous system. And it's for short-term stress. Your heart rate goes up really fast. You start breathing really hard. Cortisol doesn't do that to you. Cortisol just generally gets you alert. Not super highly sharp where you're ready to fight or run or freeze in place. It's just getting you ready for the day. When you wake up, cortisol levels spike up. When you feel like you need a midday nap, cortisol levels go down. Goes up again. And then when you get tired at night, cortisol levels drop. That's at least naturally what should happen. In the next video, we're going to look at this again in the context of everything else that the adrenal gland does. The adrenal gland is a complicated endocrine gland. Not only does it release cortisol, it releases tons of other hormones that are stimulated by different things. So what we've just gone over are 2 hormones released from the hypothalamus/posterior pituitary. And then from the hypothalamus, you get a releasing hormone stimulating six different hormones from the anterior pituitary, which will then stimulate different glands to release their own hormones. Complicated, but hopefully followable pathways here in the endocrine system. So I'll see you in the next video. Please let me know if any questions, in the comments, in the discussion. Thanks for watching.